Hello and welcome to Scottish Ancestral Records podcast, and I'm here again with Ken Nisbet of the Scottish Genealogy Society. Hello Ken, how are you doing?
Well, good evening. Oh, I'm doing fine in this kind of rubbish weather we're having. What I'm going to talk about tonight is farming, or how to find it, or some of the things, pointers towards your farming ancestry. There's not many of us that don't have people who at some point worked in the rural economy, either, for example, as ploughmen, perhaps working up to farmers themselves, or ditchers, dikers, carpenters working on estates. It's often thought that you're never going to find anything about those who worked in the rural economy, particularly if they didn't own the land or the houses in which they were staying. That, of course, they're less likely to necessarily have hundreds of pages, but you can find information on them. Usually, quite often, the first thing we know that our relatives worked on a farm is from the statutory records. They'll perhaps say that they were employed as a ploughman or farm servant from the census, for example. Mm-hmm. Quite often, when you look at a statutory record, it will simply say, it won't say it's a farm, it will simply say it's a place, it'll give a place name. I would always make use of the National Library of Scotland maps, the marvellous free collection or access that we've used, that I mentioned before, and it does cover England and Wales. I always say, being in Scotland, it's probably bigger, but the most marvellous collection you get, covering farm surveys, geology maps, if you want to know about that particular bit. Particularly look at the 25-inch to the mile map, and you will see if it is a farm or not. Because, as I say, for example, if I look at my mother's birth certificate, it says Turric Codder. Well, you don't know, is Turric a series of small buildings or is it a farm? Be careful, of course, that when they say they're in the farm, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were born in the farmhouse. It could have been farm workers' cottages that went to make up, for example, certainly with my mother. Being born in her granny's house, they were farm servants. They weren't staying in the farmhouse. Generally speaking, you won't tend to find children born in farm bothies. When you think of the northeast, you think farmhouses. Farming, of course, was different in different parts of Scotland. For example, when if you think of the Lothians, they had their farm towns, much bigger farms, much more almost industrial farms, to the smaller farms of the northeast, and perhaps down in the southwest of Scotland, Ayrshire, where you had, and of course you had, if you think of the Lothians nowadays, a lot more grain, production of crops, adds to the use of livestock, which is very much, if you think of the northeast, you think of Aberdeen Islands, you think of cattle, you think of sheep in the upper areas. And when I'm talking about farming, I'm not really talking about our crofters up in Sutherland and Caithness, but the sheep ranches of the 19th century after the clearances. So look at the maps. Then I would always look at the Ordnance Survey place names books on the Scotland's Places website. Again, a free source. The great thing with the Scotland's Places thing is, once you know the name of the property, look it up there. You'll get a brief description of the building, of the farm. It might say what the roofing is. It'll say normally who the main tenant is. It will also normally say who the landowner is. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you've got to watch that. That is referring to when the maps were created. Obviously, tenants may change over time, as indeed landowners may change. That is important because it does give you a description of the property, perhaps the size of the farm, what kind of crops it was growing. On the Scotland's People website, so www.scotlandspeople.gov.uk website, the main site that we use for the census and so on, there's two things to think about. The 1851 and 1861 census usually give the acreage of the farm and how many employees the farmer has.
Gives quite a picture then, eh?
Yeah, it gives a good picture because quite often, when we're looking at the census, we just look at our own family. If you're on a rural community, your family are not working. If you're a farm worker and you're working a farm, who's running the farm on which you're in? So look for the name of the farmer. Count the number of employees. Are they living in all the cottages surrounding that farm? Look at the little community that made up that environment. The other thing on the Scottish People website, of course, is the valuation rolls. Now, the valuation rolls on the Scottish People website, I think there's still 2 credits. They run from 1855 right through to 1940. The good thing with them is you will get the name of the tenant, you will get the name of the landowner. Now, why is it important to know the name of the landowner? Is because if you start looking at state records, which are held by National Records of Scotland, obviously they're closed at the moment, or perhaps held by local archives. There are estates, for example, if you think of the Buccleuch estates in Perthshire, huge amount of records you could look, and also the Buccleuch estates in Borders, huge amount of archival records. Some still stay with the estates, some are in local or national archives. There you're going to get stuff like rent rolls. You might get comments about individual tenancies coming to agreement. Or why did your ancestor move from the farm? Or perhaps it was his tenancy coming to an agreement or the lease, because normally you would lease a ground for a period. It could be 21 years or it could be less depending on the landowner. And there's quite often, of course, there might be complaints the fact that the farmer who's leased the land has improved the land, and then landowner says, "Oh, I don't want it anymore. I'm going to put my favourite friend in to take over." And this could happen. Nowadays, of course, we're protected. Tenants are protected, secure tenancies. Well, that certainly didn't happen in the 19th century. If your land, I thought if you had a lease, you could, if you had the money, could have taken your landowner to court. But that's not going to do you much of a good if you're then going to move in the same area. I mean, for example, certainly wouldn't work in Codder parish, where El Codder owned the entire parish, in virtually the entire parish. You know, and the same down in the area in Edinburgh, I live, if you think of the Duke of Dalkeith, Duke of Buccleuch, a lot of these estates were owned by connecting families and so on. So they all knew each other. So you didn't want to fall out with the laird.
Yeah, I can just imagine the old-fashioned 19th century didn't give him a job.
Oh, I mean, my mother still talks about her father standing in the rain in Codder Gardens, having to take his cap off to dock to the Countess. Yes, docking, it was almost it wasn't quite in slavery, but it was indentured. And of course, your cottages might belong to the estate, or they would certainly belong to the farm. Farm workers in Scotland were normally hired really for 6 months periods. But that could be longer if you got on with the farmer, but you could change every 6 months. But there would normally be, obviously, the hiring fairs every year, usually twice a year, and they'll be reported in the local paper. And that's sometimes where you'll get descriptions of wages. What the Ora man is getting paid, and various strange farming occupational. I mean, we all know about what a cattleman is, but ploughmen came in levels depending on how big the farm was. You could have number 1 ploughman down to number 4 ploughman, depending. And sometimes it will make reference in the census, not normally in statutory records, but on the census, it will normally sometimes make reference to what level of ploughman he was on the farm, because obviously ploughmen looking after the horses. If you think up until really before the end of the second, it's only post end of the First World War that we start getting mechanization coming in, particularly in the industrial in Scotland. Having horses was standard. I've got pictures of certainly of my relatives in Codder with horses, ploughmen with the horses. One of the things you might find in local newspapers is ploughing competitions, who could plough the straightest furrow. And quite often they would report it on. So that's another place that you might find reference, is ploughing is in local newspapers. Quite often that, again, you will get references to farmers, because if the farmer was moving, he would have a displenishment sale or a rout. And then they always reported on in the local newspaper. And that's one reason that your relatives might move, because if a new farmer came in and he might say, "Oh, I don't want you, I don't want to employ you anymore. There's no redundancy payments," nothing like the furlough scheme we've got nowadays or this year. If the farmer said, "Well, I don't want to hire that chap, he hasn't got a good reputation," you would be out of your cottage, you would be out of employment. You would have to go, hopefully, that someday some other farmer that you knew was hiring. That's one reason that you might find your relative moved. So when you're looking at the newspapers on the Find My Past or the British Newspaper Library website, just put in the name of the farm. Don't necessarily put the name of the farmer or the name of the individual, just put the name of the person, name of the farm. So for example, I do this with my mum's side, but I just put Broomhill, Codder, and see what comes up. And then you get you can get stories like runaway horses, or they found coins dug up in a field on the farm. Various things about the farm, or for example, crop rotation, what the farmer was selling, what crop. I've got a lovely one from West Lothian when he talks about his neighbours gave him assistance. I think he'd not been well, but his neighbours gave him assistance in ploughing up all his land in January, and that they had a kind of party in the house afterwards. So,
that's nice, isn't it?
Yes. So it adds to the family history, as I say. I mean, family history is not just getting that further. I mean, I'm sure if you've seen the most recent two programs on Who Do You Think You Are, they haven't got back terribly far, but it's the family history. It's very much.
Yeah.
And that's what it's about. When we're looking, when you come across these agricultural labourers or farm labourers or farm workers, don't give up and say, "Oh, I'm not going to find anything about them." There is stuff. There's obviously quite a lot of work we've done on the social environment. You will get academic books on them, some of which I do have on my shelf, but they're worth looking for. And it's also one of the reasons that you might find that you get relatives migration. Certainly in my case, on my mum's side, in Codder in 1861, Codder said that the family couldn't keep the lease from the croft. And when the croft was given up, 4 of the family emigrated to Australia. They took mother with them. So that's why I have a direct ancestor who dies in Australia. My ancestor stayed here because she married somebody in Codder, and she died in 1862 of typhus. But the rest of the family migrated. Now, post First World War, there was an agricultural slump in Scotland. Big agricultural slump in Scotland. Post the end of the First World War, you can imagine during the First World War, big shortage of farm workers, famine.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of farmers complaining, saying, "You've taken my last ploughman or your last shepherd."
Yeah, the land girls. That's when
you have the woman. Yes, if we think of the Women's Land Army in the Second World War, well, the Women's Land Army existed in the First World War. Mm-hmm. We also, of course, had digressing slightly, we had forestry recruits, particularly Canadians, in the First World War, just as they had in the Second World War. Yet you had the Women's Land Army, but there was a big slump in agriculture. What was it? Less demand for food. Rationing finished in the 1920s. So a lot of unemployed farm workers. So what did they? A lot in Scotland go to Canada. You'll find that there's a huge leap of rural migration to Canada in the 1920s in Scotland. People think, it was, you think of the 19th century being the migration period. Well, no, but the 20th century had it as well. Just as you saw in Ireland, when there was a big downturn in Ireland in the 20th century, people leaving Ireland in huge numbers. Well, same happened in Scotland. And a lot of it had to do with land movement. The other thing, of course, is being Scots, we think of the clearances. Now,
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
The Highland clearances, particularly those in Caithness and the Southern Estate, with Patrick Seller being the factor for the Duke of Sussex. Well, really, the Duchess of Sutherland, the Duke didn't have much to do with it. It was really the Duchess. And the big statue at Bedbrackie above Galsby. Now, so they've been, well, everybody knows about the Highland clearances, but Tom Devine has just written a really good book about the clearances, and it makes great reference to the lowland clearance. The clearances that went on, particularly in the borders, it was a more subtle clearance because it was amalgamation of small farms into large farms. I mean, if you think you go down to the borders now, and I do lots, Lisa will know from my Facebook pictures, I do lots of walking in the border, trying to avoid cows. But, a lot of big sheep farms in the borders. But if you go on the borders, you will see little piles of it or crops of featherwell houses because they have amalgamated into large farm units because they were obviously more financially viable. So where do the people go? They go to the big cities, end up in Glasgow or Edinburgh, or they migrate to places like Australia and New Zealand. The migration level from the south of Scotland was just as great as the Highlands.
Wow, yeah.
And numbers wise, it's more a romantic story. We hear about the Western Isles and the forced on the ships. But numbers wise, Central Belt and the south of Scotland is just as big number. But so also, of course, farmers can leave wills. Quite good. Again, I've got a couple of farmer ancestors who have quite good wills, again, for naming family groups, as I mentioned before. And they do make reference to leases or keeping the lease or trying to keep the lease on the farm. None of these were farmer occupiers. You really don't get farmers buying land on the whole until the end of the First World War, when death duties and income tax coming in at far higher levels, in fact, far higher levels than nowadays than today, certainly as far as income tax is concerned. A lot of sons or heirs to the land been killed in the First World War. Of course, a huge number of landed aristocracy have been killed, sometimes several sons. Who's going to inherit, or nobody to inheritance, leads to breakup of estates. The Brodie of Lethen estate in Nairnshire was pre-First World War was over 20,000 acres. It goes down to about 10. It halves, and more than halves, because Ewan Brodie gets killed in 1914. A small son to inherit, huge death age duties. So what do they have to do? They sell off the land, and that's where you start seeing farmers buying land. If you speak if you speak to any farmer and they'll say, "Oh, we've had this land," what you may find that it goes back to the 1920s when they started buying the land, maybe 100 years now. But there'll be very few of these farmers would have owned the land in the 19th century. They may have been on the farm. The family may have been on the farm, but almost anyone, they didn't own it.
That must have been quite a powerful position to be in, to be able to buy the land that they've been farming when they've had no rights before.
Well, I mean, a lot of these big estates were desperate. They didn't have the money. They needed to pay the government. So what are your assets? If you haven't got much, your assets are your land. I mean, there are yes, we think of Scotland being owned particularly by, if you think of the Clue estates down in my part of the world, I mean, and certainly Alcodder still owning most of Codder. But that's few and far. If you look at the surrounding area, out with Codder Parish and Nairnshire, there's a number of landowners shoots up after the First World War compared with, because, was just what happened. As I say, but that's when you get. It's just like, obviously, if you look at towns, you get a lot more owner-occupiers.
Mm-hmm.
Most people rented their own house, even in towns, even the middle classes generally wouldn't necessarily own their own, or they might own their own group of properties and rent. I mean, not everybody's like my dock labourers in Grangemouth, who actually owned their own house and they also owned and then rented it out. I mean, so I have dock labourers owning their own houses and then
Pretty amazing.
So the Nisbets were slightly, I wouldn't call them slum landlords, but the Nisbets were certainly renting out property in Grangemouth, but that's not farming. But there are very few of us. I'm sure you've got farming ancestors.
Yeah, northeast. It's actually quite. Forfar area. Yeah. I mean, I remember telling my dad about it, and it was actually quite funny. He was telling me that in this particular village that the ancestor stayed in, that's the place where one of his favourite chip shops is. So he'd been unknowingly visiting his ancestor's village for chips for about 5 years.
Oh, I know. And obviously, I mean, with the more well-off farmers, you might find gravestones and so on in the parish churchyard and so on. Or quite often, what you sometimes find is the parish church is nowhere near the farm. There's nowhere, and your relatives might have had to walk quite a distance to go to church, either uphill or downhill.
Yeah.
I think a bit more religious observation than certainly nowadays. There is information out there. The NLA, National Library of Scotland, have started putting some estate maps online, and so have Scotland's people. Always worth. I mean, certainly not every estate, but it's always worth having a look. And I would always recommend to people to sign up for the National Library of Scotland newsletter, and then a free newsletter in any case, because it will tell you what new maps are going on. Fairly recently, for example, they put fire insurance maps.
Interesting.
Which didn't cover all of Scotland, but certainly covered Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and so on. And very great because you can see the type of businesses that were occupying the properties. Yes, trade directory, and obviously the trade directories are on the Scotland People website. The National Library website. Do know that Scotland's People are looking at testing at some point the Kirk Session records. We don't know how they're going to charge prices, but that's obviously going to be developed. I haven't heard anything to the contrary about the 1921 census being delayed. Obviously, I think as most 2021 census has been delayed. 42. And I mean, this is unique. Even since 1801, apart from the 1941 census because of the Second World War, has the census ever been moved?
Really?
Yeah, the census has never been moved from a 10-year gap. Apart from the 1941 census, we've always had a census in 1801. The 1921 census was actually not held in April. It was held in June because of industrial action by civil servants. Delayed to actually June, so you won't get it around Easter time as you normally would. When we do have access to it, and it's going to be a different set of questions, but obviously we'll cover that in future podcasts.
Yeah.
Might have a special census podcast. Never know these up next.
Yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it?
When it's released. But there are things you can find out about your relatives. It's using multiple sources to create that story. Just as we use multi sources for looking into military research or any particular group of individuals. Also make use, if you Sign up to the National Library of Scotland digital collection. Do look at stuff like parliamentary reports. You might think they're boring to look at, or might not be of interest, but they are, because fascinating. These are the blue books. These are the books that, for example, if you in 100 years when somebody's reading about COVID, you're not going to look at what Nicola Sturgeon said. You're going to look at what Professor Jason Leach is reporting on. You'll be looking at the blue books, other reports, going out and interviewing people, speaking to people. And for example, the stuff that I would quite often look at is education. And that's certainly something I think I'm going to cover in the next podcast, is schooling and education. Very important subject to cover, Scotland's attitude towards education. So that's certainly a subject that will come up. But, for our listeners out there, if you've got a topic, you can always send a message to Lisa, and I will do my best to try and answer it. As long as it's Scottish, I'm not an expert in Irish.
Yeah.
On Irish genealogy. A wee bit on English, but certainly, and certainly Canadian, Australian, New Zealanders, I'm more than I'll have to answer.
And we can share that as part of the social media post. So if anyone does have any suggestions for topics, that will be quite interesting. It'll be interesting to see what people come back with. Yeah.
El main Spanish flu thing, of course, I guess everybody knows it didn't start in Spain. It got its name in Spain because Spain was the one place that had the free press for war back then, because it was neutral. They could report on it, but everybody else was keeping skim about it. But if you look, for example, at the death registers for Greenock in 1918, you will see huge number of Americans.
Wow.
Young, because the suspicion is that it started in the States.
Wow.
And that started in training camps in the States. American troops coming over here, the doughboys, coming in huge numbers, particularly to France, and so on. And then it started spreading around Europe and from Europe. And I will say there's huge training camps in the States, so it spread in the States and then to South America and Mexico.
Yeah, fun.
And obviously globally. It is important because it did have a big impact. The pandemic of 1919 to 1921, with, as I said, several waves, is one reason that you might find that you see relatives die in that period. It tended to be affect the teenagers and those in their 20s and 30s, unlike the current disease.
Which is
I hope you found tonight's podcast of use and of interest.
Yes, as always, I've taken copious notes, Ken,
for
all these different sources. Actually, also has a course coming up that I'd like to share.
Yes, it's through Dundee Lifelong Learning. So if you look for lifelong learning in Dundee on the web, and you'll see it. It's a 6-week course starting on the 10th of November, and I think it's about £45. You get to listen to me warble for 2 hours, and you do get handouts, and you get a PowerPoint presentation. The first 6 weeks are aimed at beginners, and then we do a kind of more advanced one in January. We may change the dates for the January one from a Saturday to a Tuesday evening, but that's finalised. But I know that there certainly will be spaces on it if anybody wants to sign up for that.
Yeah, and we will share the link for that also in the post. So if you're looking for a wee bit more information on studying with Ken, click on that. So thank you very much, Ken. That's fantastic. And next time we're going to be speaking about education, or unless we're directed otherwise by listeners.
Okay.